October 23, 1942. Dawn breaks over the Egyptian desert. Inside the steel hulls of Italian M1340 tanks, men wait in silence. The air's already hot. Diesel fumes cling to the walls. Sweat runs down backs pressed against riveted armor. Fingers check shell racks one last time. 47mm rounds. Machine guns loaded. Everything feels familiar. Everything feels prepared. Outside, engines rumble across the sand. Hundreds of Italian tanks sit spread along the line, dug in, facing east. The men inside them believe this is another battle they can endure. They have trained. They have learned. They have survived worse. Then, through periscopes clouded with dust, shapes appear on the horizon. They are larger than expected, taller, heavier. They do not rush forward. They advance slowly, deliberately, as if unafraid of what waits ahead. Long gun barrels catch the rising light. Sloped steel glints through the haze. For the first time, Italian tank crews are looking at American Sherman tanks. In that moment, before the first shot is fired, something shifts. Not fear, not panic, but a quiet, unsettling realization that this fight will not be like the others. For the men inside those tanks, the M1340 is more than steel and rivets. It is Italy's answer to modern war. They know its shape by heart: the narrow turret, the short-barreled gun, the growl of the diesel engine beneath their feet. This machine has carried them across Libya, through dust storms and artillery fire, through months of retreat and rebuilding. It is familiar. It is trusted. Italian commanders have told them this tank is enough. Its 47mm gun can destroy British cruisers. Its armor has held against enemy fire before, and it burns diesel, not petrol, a small mercy in a war where fire often means death. The men believe that if they fight well, if they close the distance, if they aim carefully, their tank will do its job. They also believe something else. That war is still decided by courage. For years, fascist propaganda has told them Italy is a modern power, standing shoulder to shoulder with Germany, challenging old empires with new steel. The M1340 is proof of that promise. It is the most produced Italian tank of the war, the backbone of their armored forces, the symbol of what Italy can build. There are doubts, of course, quiet ones. The armor feels thin when shells strike nearby. The turret is cramped, forcing the commander to aim and command at the same time. Many crews received only weeks of training before being sent to Africa. But these concerns are pushed aside. Every army has problems. Every tank has weaknesses. What matters, they tell themselves, is that they have learned. What matters is that they are ready. As the sun rises higher over El Alamein, Italian tankers grip their controls and wait for the order to fire, still believing that experience, discipline, and bravery can bridge any gap. Most of these men have already been to war before El Alamein. They remember how their tanks first arrived in North Africa in late 1940, unloaded from ships into a desert that swallowed machines whole. Sand-clogged engines, heat-punished metal, crews trained for weeks, sometimes only days, before being sent forward. Units were assembled hastily, men who barely knew one another, learning under fire. Their first real test came during the British offensive known as Operation Compass. At places like Bardia, Italian armor was committed piecemeal. Many tanks went into battle without radios. Orders had to be shouted, signaled by hand, or delivered by men climbing out under fire. When British artillery began to fall, coordination collapsed. Tanks fought alone, blinded by dust and smoke, destroyed before they could even see their attackers. The losses were catastrophic. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed or captured. Entire formations ceased to exist in a matter of days. Survivors remembered the helplessness most of all, the feeling of being sealed inside a machine that could not respond fast enough, could not communicate, could not escape. Yet even then, the tank itself was not condemned. Those who survived told themselves the defeat had causes that could be corrected: better training, better leadership, better coordination. They pointed out that when the M1340 did manage to engage British light tanks, its gun could still kill. Its armor could still resist. The problem, they believed, was not the machine, but how it was being used. And so the lesson they carried forward was a dangerous one. They believed defeat was temporary. They believed experience would close the gap. They believed the war had not yet revealed its true shape. By the time the next great battle approached, Italian tankers were no longer naive, but they were still unprepared for what was coming. By 1941, Italian tank crews were no longer the same men who had fled Bardia. The defeats had burned away illusions. What remained was experience, earned the hard way. Training programs were expanded. New armored schools opened in Italy. Crews drilled longer, harder, and more realistically. Radios finally became standard equipment, allowing tanks to fight as units instead of isolated machines. For the first time, Italian armor could coordinate. They learned how to maneuver under fire, how to mask movement with dust and terrain, how to work alongside infantry and anti-tank guns. German advisors drilled them relentlessly. Mistakes were punished in exercises long before they were punished in battle. And slowly, something changed. At Bir el Gubi in November 1941, Italian tanks of the Ariete Division met British Crusaders head-on. For an entire day, steel clashed across the desert. Smoke rose from burning vehicles on both sides. This time, Italian crews held their ground. British tanks were knocked out in significant numbers. By evening, the British withdrew. It was not a miracle. It was not propaganda. It was proof. Given training, coordination, and time, Italian tankers could fight as well as their enemies. They learned to trust one another. They learned their machines. They learned how to survive. Through the battles of Gazala in 1942, Italian armor continued to show flashes of effectiveness. Crews closed the distance, struck flanks, and used terrain with skill. They fought desperately, intelligently, and with growing confidence. For the men inside the M1340, this mattered deeply. It meant the early disasters had not been destiny. It meant the sacrifices had taught something. It meant they had not been wrong to believe. But even as Italian crews improved, the war was changing faster than they could adapt. They were learning how to fight yesterday's war, while tomorrow was already rolling toward them. By early 1942, Italian tank crews began to notice a change on the battlefield. British tanks were no longer the same machines they had fought before. Engagements were starting at longer distances. Enemy shells were arriving faster, heavier, and with far more destructive force. Italian gunners found themselves firing again and again, only to watch their rounds fall short or shatter harmlessly against enemy armor. The first real shock came with the arrival of the American-built M3 Grant. It was an awkward-looking tank, tall and ungainly, with its main gun mounted in the hull rather than a turret. But its 75mm gun changed everything. It could reach out far beyond the effective range of the Italian 47. It could punch through armor at distances where Italian crews could only watch and wait. For the first time, Italian tankers were being destroyed before they could fight back. The weaknesses of the M1340 became impossible to ignore. Its armor was thin and mostly vertical, offering little protection against modern guns. Worse still, it was riveted. When enemy shells struck, even without penetrating, metal rivets sheared loose and ricocheted through the fighting compartment like bullets, killing and wounding men who thought they were safe. Inside the cramped two-man turret, commanders were overwhelmed. One man was expected to observe the battlefield, command the tank, aim the gun, and fire all at once. Reaction times slowed, situational awareness collapsed, crews tried to adapt, sandbags were piled onto hulls, spare track links were welded onto vulnerable plates, anything that might stop a shell was added. But every improvised fix made the tank heavier, slower, and more prone to breakdown. Engines overheated, transmissions failed. Tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could no longer move. Italian commanders knew the truth. These measures were desperation, not solutions. And yet, the men inside the tanks kept fighting. They told themselves this was the worst the enemy could field, that no machine could be stronger than the Grant, that once again, experience would close the gap. But even as they struggled to survive, something far more dangerous was approaching the desert. Not a single tank, not a new tactic, but an entirely different way of waging war. By the summer of 1942, rumors began to circulate through Axis lines in North Africa. They came quietly at first, from German units, from reconnaissance reports, from British prisoners, stories of a new American tank arriving at the front, a machine larger than anything Italian crews had faced before, faster, better protected. built not in small numbers but in endless waves. At first, many dismissed the rumors. Every war produced exaggerations. Every enemy claimed to have a wonder weapon. Italian tankers had already faced the Grant, and they had survived. Awkward or not, it had been beaten in close combat. Surely this new tank would be no different. But the details kept returning. This tank had a fully rotating turret, a powerful 75mm gun, thick, sloped armor designed to deflect shells, a 5-man crew, each with a single, clear task. More troubling still was what the rumor said about its origins. This was not a tank rushed into service. It was not a stopgap. It had been designed for mass production from the beginning, built in factories that ran day and night, built in numbers Italy could not imagine, let alone match. Italian crews listened in silence as these reports spread. Some laughed them off, others grew uneasy. A few began to understand what this might mean, not just a better tank, but an enemy whose strength did not come from bravery or sacrifice, but from scale. As autumn approached, British activity along the front intensified. Supplies moved forward, artillery positions multiplied. The desert itself seemed to vibrate with preparation. Italian tankers checked their vehicles again and again. Engines, guns, armor, everything they could control. What they could not control was what was coming toward them. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the rumors were becoming reality. On the night of October 23, 1942, the desert erupted. Nearly 1,000 Allied guns opened fire along the Alamein line. The bombardment rolled across the sand in waves, shaking the ground, tearing wire apart, churning minefields into clouds of dust and flame. For hours, Italian positions were buried beneath high explosive and shrapnel. Inside their tanks, crews could do nothing but wait, counting the seconds between impacts, listening to steel ring under each concussion. Just before dawn, the guns fell silent. Then came the tanks. As the sun rose, Italian commanders peered through their optics and saw armored shapes advancing through smoke and dust. At first, they seemed distant, almost unreal. Then, the outlines sharpened. These were not Grants. These were not Crusaders. They were broader, lower than expected. Their armor sloped sharply, shedding light and dust. Long, 75mm guns rested calmly in rotating turrets. They moved with a confidence Italian crews had never seen before. The Shermans halted, not at Italian firing range, but well beyond it. Moments later, the first shells landed among the M1340s. Italian tanks erupted in fire and smoke as armor was punched through from the front. Turrets were torn open, ammunition detonated. Crews had no time to react. Italian gunners returned fire desperately. Shells struck Sherman hulls and glanced away. Others shattered uselessly. Even solid hits failed to stop them. The Shermans simply adjusted, fired again, and destroyed their targets one by one. What shocked Italian crews most was not just the firepower, it was the control. The Shermans chose when to fight. They chose the distance. They advanced, stopped, fired, and moved again with methodical precision, supported by infantry, artillery, and radios, linking everything together. Inside their tanks, Italian crews began to understand the truth. They were no longer facing an opponent they could outfight. They were facing one they could not reach. And for the first time, survival, not victory, became the goal. Once the first shock passed, Italian tank crews tried to fight back. Drivers pushed their engines to the limit, maneuvering through shell holes and wreckage, searching for any fold in the terrain that might offer cover. Gunners aimed not at armor, but at tracks, suspensions, anything that might slow the Shermans long enough to escape or reposition. It was desperate, calculated bravery, but every exchange revealed the same truth. The M1340 was fighting a tank from another era. Its armor was thin and vertical, offering little resistance. The Sherman's armor was thicker, sloped, and forgiving of mistakes. Italian shells that would have destroyed earlier tanks now ricocheted away or shattered on impact. The imbalance extended beyond armor and guns. Inside the Sherman, 5 men worked as a team. A dedicated commander observed the battlefield, issuing orders without distraction. A gunner focused solely on aiming and firing. A loader kept the gun fed. A driver and assistant driver maneuvered the tank smoothly across broken ground. Radios tied every vehicle into a single coordinated force. Inside the M1340, one man tried to do everything. Commanders shouted orders while searching for targets, aiming the gun and firing, all while shells slammed against the hull. Reaction times slowed, opportunities vanished in seconds, and then there was mobility. The Sherman's powerful engine allowed it to reposition at will. Climb terrain Italian tanks struggled to cross and withdraw before danger closed in. Italian engines overheated, transmissions failed, tanks broke down under strain, left behind not by enemy fire, but by physics. Despite this, Italian units did not collapse. At El Alamein, formations like the Ariete Armored Division launched repeated counterattacks fully aware of the odds. Crews advanced into firestorms, knowing their guns could not penetrate frontally, knowing many would not return. Lieutenant Pascucci led his remaining tanks forward in one final charge, buying time for others to retreat. His attack did not stop the advance, it could not, but it delayed it at the cost of his life. By the time the battle ended, the result was undeniable. The Allies had lost hundreds of tanks, but most would be repaired and returned to service. Italian armor, by contrast, had been annihilated. Of the hundreds of M13 and M14 tanks committed, only a handful escaped destruction or abandonment. Italian tankers had not been defeated by fear. They had not been defeated by lack of skill. They had been defeated by mathematics. For those Italian tankers who survived El Alamein, the war did not end with the retreat. Their burned-out machines were left behind in the desert, skeletal hulls marking where entire crews had vanished. The men themselves were gathered, disarmed, and marched away from the battlefield. Many expected humiliation, some expected revenge, few expected what came next. They were sent west, far west. Weeks later, Italian prisoners found themselves aboard American Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic. Even these ships made an impression. They were plain utilitarian vessels, built without elegance or ceremony. But they were everywhere. New ships arriving as others departed. Construction schedules measured in weeks, not years. To men who had watched Italy struggle to replace a single destroyed tank, the scale was unsettling. On board, the abundance was impossible to ignore. Food arrived regularly: fresh bread, meat, coffee. Portions were large, often excessive. American sailors complained about meals Italian officers would have considered luxuries. Food was thrown away, not because it was spoiled, but because there was simply more than anyone needed. When the ships docked in American ports, the shock deepened. Cranes lifted cargo that would have required entire work crews in Italy. Trains arrived and departed constantly. Everything ran on electricity. Everything moved quickly, efficiently, relentlessly. Italian prisoners were placed on trains and carried inland, not in freight cars but in passenger coaches. As they passed through towns and cities, the men pressed their faces to the windows. Lights burned everywhere. Factories worked through the night. Parking lots were filled with automobiles, hundreds of them, belonging to ordinary workers. For many, this was the moment the war finally made sense. The tanks that had destroyed them in the desert were not miracles. They were products of a system that produced abundance as easily as Italy produced scarcity. Life in American prisoner of war camps deepened the lesson the journey had begun. Italian officers and enlisted men expected harsh treatment. Instead, they found order. Medical examinations, clean barracks, regular meals. Rules that were enforced but predictable. Guards who followed procedures rather than moods. For many, it was their first sustained encounter with a functioning industrial democracy. They were assigned work details on farms and workshops, maintaining roads and facilities. Everywhere they went, the same pattern appeared. Machines were plentiful, tools were standardized, spare parts were available. When something broke, it was repaired or replaced without delay. Factories near the camps produced aircraft, trucks, weapons, and ammunition in staggering quantities. Trains carried materials in and finished products out without pause. There were no speeches about sacrifice, no banners promising glory, just schedules, quotas, and results. Italian officers spoke among themselves in quiet conversations. They compared this to home, to factories starved of raw materials, to tanks delayed for months by shortages of steel, fuel, and skilled labor, to an economy stretched thin long before the war had truly begun. Here, they saw the answer to the question Alamein had raised. The Sherman was not superior because Americans were braver. It was superior because it was supported by oil fields and railways, by universities and engineers, by workers who earned enough to buy the very cars they built, by a system that turned civilian abundance into military power without breaking itself. In the camps, the final illusion collapsed. The war had never been decided at the front. It had been decided in factories, ports, and power stations years earlier. By the time many Italian prisoners were released, they already knew the outcome of the war, even before it was officially over. When the war ended, Italian tankers returned home to a country in ruins. Cities were scarred by bombing. Factories stood silent or shattered. The promises that had sent them to Africa lay exposed as illusions. Fascism had not fallen because Italians lacked courage. It had fallen because it could not sustain reality. For those who had faced the Sherman, the lesson was already clear. They no longer saw the American tank as a single machine. They saw what stood behind it. An economy that could absorb losses without collapse. A society that trained specialists, not improvisers. A system that valued reliability over spectacle, logistics over slogans. The M1340 had been built to prove a point. The Sherman had been built to win a war. In the years that followed, Italy rebuilt itself along different lines. Factories returned, roads, railways, and power stations multiplied. Production replaced rhetoric, cooperation replaced control. The same country that had once struggled to equip a single armored division would become one of Europe's great industrial economies. The former tankers understood this transformation better than most. They had seen the difference firsthand, through a gun sight in the desert, and later through the windows of a train. Crossing America. At El Alamein, the Sherman destroyed Italian tanks. But its greater impact came afterward. It destroyed the illusion that ideology could replace industry, that sacrifice could substitute for systems, that belief alone could win modern war. And in that realization, painful as it was, lay the foundation for everything that came next. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to remember the men inside those tanks, on both sides. History is shaped not just by victories, but by the moments when reality becomes impossible to ignore. If you have thoughts, or if this story changed how you see the war, share them below. These stories endure only if they are remembered.